All right, and welcome back to the Bullfish Hole podcast. Today I have with me Brad Wilcox, a sociologist at the University of Virginia and author of the recently published book, Get Married. Brad, thanks for coming onto my podcast.
Good to be with you here today, Jason.
I appreciate it. So, the title of the book isn't subtle. Get Married. There's a clear advocacy position here. You're promoting marriage, you're talking about the benefits of it. And I think to some people, they would wonder why you would even need to write a book advocating for marriage. And I think of something like back in the 90s, the comedian Paula Poundstone had a joke about politicians who identified themselves as pro family. Like, who are the anti family politicians? Isn't it just like a hollow position?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jason. And I think what we have seen in the polling, for instance, is a major shift away from kind of viewing marriage and family as a key source of fulfillment towards looking to especially work and career, Jason, as a crucial source of fulfillment. In polling done by both the Wall Street Journal and by Pew. And then in my book, I talk a lot about how a lot of left-wing journalists and academics have been kind of making, in a sense, the case for prioritizing work and minimizing the encumbrances of marriage and family life. And then now we have on the right, we have Andrew Tate and Pearl Davis and others, what are called the red pill right, who are arguing that men should steer clear of marriage and instead focus on making a lot of money, getting physically fit, having lots of, sex with the opposite, sex, but, not really investing in relationships and marriage. So that's the dynamic we're facing. And I do think that, we need to sort of articulate more strongly and more powerfully the benefits and value of marriage and family for adults in general and young adults in particular.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking about some of that stuff because I know in your book you cite like Atlantic or New Yorker or whatever prestige press articles with somebody talking about, I left my family to go find myself and it was the best thing ever, and sort of extolling that as a prestigious thing. But then you also got this sort of more right wing or misogynist version of it you see online, that you can't trust women. Do you think to some extent those two things feed each other?
Yeah, I do think we've been having kind of, in some ways, an anti-marriage, anti-family message coming from the left, certain precincts in the left for a long time now, kind of minimizing the value of prioritizing, marriage and your spouse and kids and all that. And I think, and also kind of prioritizing too, kind of doing what you want to do as an individual, kind of privileging a me first mindset over a family first ethos, if you will. And that's come primarily from the left, really since the 1970s in some important respects. But it did, I think, feed into kind of a culture of divorce that has then made now, these figures on the right sort of reject marriage as a kind of trap for men and sort of argue that it's not worth investing in something which is so fragile and so likely to lead, to divorce court. And so now we have an anti-marriage message that's being articulated from the red pill right, partially in response to the more anti-nuptial messages that have permeated the culture from the left to some extent. But beyond this kind of ideological debate, I think there's just a way in which technology, inequality, affluence, competition all kind of combine to encourage young adults to really prioritize education, money, and especially work over kind of focusing on getting married and having family. There's good research in Southeast Asia too that sort of talks about the role of inequality and urbanicity and technology, social media especially, and sort of encouraging a kind of more status-seeking orientation to life rather than family formation orientation. So I think that's also another reason why it's important to write a book like Get Married, to kind of get young adults to get off the work focus and shift their attention to finding a spouse and getting married and starting a family.
I mean, I guess part of the diagnosis of why there's some hesitancy or negativity about marriage. I mean, you got two pieces, right? You have like the careerist or workist piece where people just deprioritize it, but you also have the kind of paranoia piece where people think it might be a bad deal, and the fragility of marriage can be a self-reinforcing thing where people are scared to get involved. Which leads me to the question of how exactly how common is divorce now? Because you hear the statistic a lot that about half of marriages end in divorce. I mean, does that mean that if I'm single and I get married, I have a 50-50 shot of making it?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons people are not getting married or they're postponing marriage needlessly is they're worried about divorce and they're worried about putting a ring on it for fear of eventually landing in divorce court. And most people think that about 1 in 2 marriages today, Jason, end in divorce, but it's not the case. We've seen the divorce rate come down since 1980 by about 40%. And we probably would estimate, that around 40% of first marriages will end in divorce today, which is not great, but it's not 1 in 2 either. So most marriages will go the distance. And based upon my research for the book, there are things like stable work for the husband, regular date nights, shared church attendance, a college degree are linked to markedly lower risks of divorce too. So I think it's also something important to let your college students know, for instance, that already by getting a college degree, you're the kind of person who is a lot less likely to end up getting divorced, than other Americans might today. So that's the point that I make to my students at UVA, for instance. Um, so again, the point is that there are some things that either you can do or take comfort in that can reduce the risk of divorce. So it's markedly, in a sense, below that average level, if you will.
In your book, you start off talking about some of the negativity towards marriage and the frequency of divorce and mixing good news and bad news about it from your point of view. And then you talk about some specifically the benefits of marriage, like you have the message get married. So what are the reasons too? Or how would you summarize this? What are the main benefits as you see it of getting married?
Well, Aristotle said that we're social animals, Jason, and I think people don't always appreciate how much their friendships and family relationships end up meaning for them, especially in midlife and later life. And what my book argues is that kind of there's no better path to prosperity and to happiness for the average person than marriage, especially a good marriage. So just on the financial front, we see, for instance, that both for men and women, about 10 times the assets in their 50s if they're married, stably married, compared to their peers who are never married. Markedly different rates of poverty and affluence as well, even controlling for things like race and education as well. So there's just a real strong connection between a certain measure of financial security and marriage that we see. And it's grown stronger since the 70s when I was born. On the happiness front, we see that people who are married with kids are about twice as likely to be very happy with their lives compared to those who are single and childless. And marriage about doubles your odds of being very happy in the general social survey. So that's, I think noteworthy. And then married people are less lonely and report more meaningful lives as well in my book. Now, I think we can have a discussion about selection effects here, obviously, if you want to do that. But there is this assumption out there in the pop culture oftentimes and in the media and social media as well that married folks are worse off than their single peers, especially single childless peers. And that's a kind of a descriptive claim that's being made, right? And that's false. I mean, anyone who's got access to a decent data set on money or on happiness or loneliness will figure out pretty darn quickly that married folks, on average, including married women, are doing markedly better than their single peers in the U.S.
Right. I'm going to press you a little bit on the selection effect question, though. I mean, for something
Sure.
like the so-called marriage premium, that married men tend to make more money than unmarried men. I mean, how much of that is a selection effect where go-getters are more likely to get married in the first place?
I would say that's what we would call an endogenous or reciprocal series of effects when it comes to marriage and money, for instance. So it is true that for instance, men who make more money are more likely to get married in the first place. Men who are stably employed are more likely to get married in the first place than their male peers who are not. So there's no question that men who are doing better financially and professionally select into marriage at higher levels. But conditional on that reality, we still see, from my reading of the literature, that married men work harder, work more strategically, are less likely to be fired than their roughly equivalent male peers, who are not married. And even having a twin study based on a large sample of Minnesota twins, where the identical twin brothers who were married were earning about 26% more than their identical male twin who was not married. So that's pretty strong, evidence that there's something about marriage per se. And in my book, I talk about, how this works in practice. I talk about a guy, for instance, from the Midwest who was working in a factory and then got married and joined the military to kind of improve his income and his housing options and diligently worked through the military ranks and then transitioned to being a car dealer, salesman, and, was making six figures without any college degree, in large part because he was motivated to support his wife and kids as a married father. And we do see that the income premium is largest for married men who are living with their biological children. So there's just, I think a lot of very suggestive evidence that there's something about the responsibilities that, flow from marriage and caring for a wife and kids that boosts men's income. The other big point that I make here, right, is that family instability, Jason, is very expensive. Okay. And so if you're having kids and you're not stably married, if you're the mother, typically you're going to be a single mom living on your own without the benefit of the father's pooled income, 100% pooled income. You're going to maintain two households, right? Father and the mother, separate households. That's very expensive. Court costs can be expensive if you get divorced, lawyers' fees. For men, you're often paying child support. You have your wages can be garnished. So I think it's also just important to stress that for people who are skeptical about the benefits of marriage, there's just no question. If you're having kids, adults who are stably married are just doing way better financially, even in similar positions to their peers who are not stably married with like similar jobs and similar educations, right? So because family instability is just super expensive too. So that's another kind of point that's often, I think, not when you kind of map out what is about marriage that's helpful. One thing is it just also, if you stay married, you're much less likely to experiencing costs related to any number of legal or household move issues that attend to family instability as well.
Right. I mean, you can add me to your qualitative examples here. Since I got married, I started teaching summer classes and applying for grants and other little bits of extra income I never bothered with before. Very much it was motivated by having a family.
Yes. And we actually have, there's a study of, it's interesting. It's male graduate students are much more likely to finish their PhDs quickly if they're married versus not being married. So, again, how much is that selection? I'm sure some of it, but as sociologists, we would also appreciate the roles of norms and customs and, roles as motivating forces in human behavior too.
Well, no, I took sociology of family in grad school with the late Stephen Knock. So I've read Marriage in Men's Lives. But between that and my personal experience as a family man, I got no trouble believing marriage brings benefits for men. But one thing you see, like for example, in the suicide literature, it has a lesser protective effect on women than on men. And I know a lot of people would probably ask, well, what specifically are the benefits for women? Do they get as much out of it as men do?
I think on the outcomes, there's some differences, and both Stephen Knock and others have argued that men benefit more from marriage than women do on average, and I would grant that on some outcomes. But financially, there's no question that women benefit about as much as men do, in some cases more than men do, when it comes to things like asset accumulation. And on the sort of kind of outcomes like your suicide or happiness, I think the benefits are smaller for women than they are for men. But what's interesting, as you know, on the suicide front, is that women who are not mothers are more likely to commit suicide than women who are mothers. And the benefits of parenthood are bigger for women when it comes to preventing suicide than they are for men. So I think on some social emotional outcomes, like parenthood could be more important for women than it is for men. But I think it's important just to think about this as a kind of a package deal and to sort of understand and appreciate that for most women, being a married mother is just much easier and better than being a single mother. Financially and emotionally, we see that married moms do markedly better than single moms do. And so, the challenge here then is just to recognize that even though marriage may benefit men a bit more than it does women, and you kind of put it into a larger family context and recognize that your kids are going to do better if they're raised by married parents. There's a reason for women to kind of invest in marriage, even if they're not going to benefit in precisely the same ways from it as men do. It would be recognizing that it's going to be better for your kids, for your financial well-being, and for you as well to be married, typically stably married, even though you may not benefit in precisely the same ways and as much on some outcomes as your husband might benefit, or men in general might benefit from marriage.
So you mentioned the outcomes for children, and you have a whole chapter on that in your book on the advantages shared by children who grow up in intact homes versus the disadvantages of those who grew up in unstable families. And of course, I think one thing a lot of critics will point to is that, well, how much of this is due to confounding from heredity effects, like that your parents had unstable relationships produces bad outcomes for the same reason that, blue-eyed parents tend to have blue-eyed children. You inherit whatever unstable traits So, do we have any evidence of this being specifically a treatment effect, the effect of experiencing family instability during youth?
That's a great question, Jason. And I think we have to think about this though in two different ways. So I'm going to answer it first in response to the way you're thinking about it. There's how do individual kids, right? How are they affected by their own family structure? And it is certainly the case that once again on the selection front, that the kinds of people who select into marriage and stable marriage, especially, are more educated, they're more affluent, they're more religious, and they probably have underlying genetic traits or characteristics that also are related to these kinds of patterns as well. And so some of the story here is biological, which I think the left doesn't really think about too much here. But we do have twin studies as well when it comes to child outcomes. And what they're doing is typically comparing mothers who are twins, where one mom is stably married and one mom is divorced, and how their kids are doing. So to try to figure out what's the genetic story here. And Bob Emery at UVA actually is one of the psychologists who's done this work. And they do find on in some social emotional outcomes that even controlling for genetic factors are still in effect. But there's also work done now too on interactions between nature and nurture and how certain genes are expressed in ways where, like, when the father is present, like the boy does better than other boys. When the father is absent, the boy does worse than other boys. So it's not just that we need to control for biological confounds. We need to, I think more deeply about how nature and nurture are interacting for our kids, and how for some kids they're pretty resilient in the face of family instability or absent parent, usually absent father. But other kids have a certain kind of vulnerability, if you will, Jason. And so when they experience family instability or they experience an absent parent, they're worse off, than they would be with a stable marriage or stable family or with a present father. Work done by my late mentor Sarah McClanahan has looked at this interaction between genes and environment. So I think we have to think. There's some people on the right, Richard Hanaya, for instance, who would sort of say it's all genes. Kids' behavior is all genes, but he's not read the literature. He's just saying that. Like there's good literature that looks at the interaction between specific genes and family instability that I think is pretty compelling. But the final piece that I want to make clear too is there's an ecological story here that we tend to neglect. And we know from the work of Raj Chetty, for instance, that kids who are raised in communities with more two-parent families are more likely to rise economically than kids who are raised in communities with lots of single-parent families. And this has been shown in cities and rural communities, et cetera. So I would argue there's also an ecological story here that we need to attend to. It's not just about what's happening in your household. It's about what's happening in your household, your neighbor's household, your kid's school, the larger community context. And when you've got lots of stable families, you just have safer communities. You've got better performing schools. You've got, just people are happier. We know that too from Gallup data. And when there's a lot of family instability and single parenthood, you have more crime, poor performing schools, less happy adults, and that affects our kids too. So when you think about kind of the family structure story in kids, just to recognize it, I think it's operating in a variety of ways and at a number of different levels. And part of that, yes, is about biology, but it's also about the social conditions that our kids experience growing up.
I mean, also, like, we always try to, like, or people tend to, like, connect these things to these measurable, quantifiable outcomes. Like, does your kid, are they more likely to get into college or go to prison or whatever? But, I think it's something like fishing with my father, who passed away 4 years ago. Did fishing with him make me more likely to get a PhD? Probably measurably no, but I'm glad to have the memory of fishing with him. It's a good in itself. And I think, like Charles Murray, something similar about, the reason to read to your kids isn't because it'll get them into a better school. It's because it's a good thing to do with your children. But that's
Right.
getting into sort of things you value for themselves in their own right.
No, but it's an important point though, Jason. I think it's just, I think sometimes as scientists, we look at relationships in too much of an instrumental way, right?
Mhm.
And so it's, does this lead to more money or more schooling or less crime or, whatever else? But, I think we can appreciate that there's an intrinsic dimension to life, and that friendship and family, I think, are for many of us at the core of that intrinsic dimension to life, and having the experience of both being loved, but I would say even if actually here empirically, the experience of loving someone else is incredibly valuable. And I find in marriage, for instance, that being the recipient of generosity from your spouse boosts your marital happiness, no surprise. But being generous towards your spouse boosts your marital happiness even more. controlling for other factors. So I think just the experience of things, especially valuable for men, to be frank, too, have opportunities as a man to love someone else and then to love your children in a very concrete way, day in, day out, is incredibly generative and meaningful.
Right. And so you don't just focus on the effects of marriage per se. You talk about marital quality. Partly because that predicts whether you divorce, and divorce brings with it all sorts of dangers and negative impact. But just because marital quality matters to the benefits of marriage. And you talk about several factors that both improve quality and reduce divorce risk. And one that stuck out in my mind was you had a chapter subheading called The Paradox of Marital Happiness. Can you explain that phrase, please?
So, yeah, the paradox of marital happiness is that if you're directly striving to be happily married, I think you're less likely to be happily married. And if you're, by contrast, just trying to be a decent spouse, a good spouse, you're more likely to be happily married. And so the point is that, if you're kind of looking at your wife to make you happy or your husband to make you happy, and you're kind of waiting for them to do certain things for you, or you're kind of like keeping track of how much they've done versus how much you've done, you're probably going to be unhappy. But if you're looking just trying to be a good spouse, to listen well, to do your share of the household labor, to engage with the life of the family, to be an involved parent, all that kind of stuff. I thought about kind of family first marriage, then I think you're much more likely to be happily married because you're both kind of being more virtuous. And then also you're more likely to, obviously to typically, if you marry well, obviously this is a key caveat, but to engender a sense of a kind of virtuous cycle that, as you're kind of investing in your family, your wife or your husband notices, and they do likewise too. And everyone's relatively, not all the time, of course, but, are generally going to be happier when, they're highly invested in their marriage and their kids.
Yeah, I think the point maybe generalizes too. The pursuit of happiness seems like kind of a lousy way to become happy. I had an acquaintance or a friend really back in the gap who was always concerned with what'll make me happy, what'll make me happy. He was just making himself miserable thinking about it and trying whatever combination of things would be the one-time solution. I was like, man, just pour yourself into something else. Stop focusing on it, then you'll be happy.
And that's consistent too with just the larger psychology of happiness. We just know that people who are trying to be happy in general are not likely to be happy. And folks who are just trying to live a good life, whether it's being a good athlete or being a good, professional or a good spouse, good community member, are more likely to be, happy.
I guess this is a related question, but what are some things, or if you could boil it down, what do you think is the most important thing someone in a marriage can do to avoid the risk of divorce?
I think commitment is the most important thing. So just having the mentality heading into a marriage that divorce is not on your radar screen, that you're in this for life, that it's going to be tough at times, you made a commitment, and you love this person, you're willing to sacrifice for them. So a commitment, I think, is crucial. But I also find too that, and I've touched on this, but like, making an effort to keep the romantic sparks alive, like regular date nights, having stable income, especially from the husband, is definitely a predictor of marital stability. Community that supports your marriage and family, especially religious one, is helpful as well. So these are the kinds of things that I think are helpful in stabilizing marriage. But I think commitment is the most important factor there.
So I took some questions from my Substack follows, and Thomas Hutchinson looks at this at the decline of marriage from the female side and asks, where have all the marriageable men gone? So is that part of the equation? Are there fewer marriageable men, and where have they gone?
So yeah, I think I do argue in the book that there are, in a sense, fewer marriageable men, and I mean that in the sense that there are fewer men who are stably employed, especially men who don't have college degrees. And as I speak to younger women, both on the left and the right, they often will report the men that they are dating or that they're encountering don't seem to have a very clear sense of direction, kind of an openness to commitment, a sense of agency, if you will. So I think this is a real problem that a lot of men are floundering, a lot of boys are floundering in our current culture. And I would trace this back to a couple of things, changes in the economy that have made it harder for men who don't have a college degree or that more analytical or, service-oriented approach to life as their primary professional orientation, are more likely to struggle in this contemporary economy. A lot of our technologies basically inhibit teenage boys from flourishing because they're focused on gaming and other things that don't lead them to flourish both socially and professionally longer term. And then I think we have a problem when it comes to kind of defining and articulating and cultivating a pro-social masculinity in this culture, an idea that there's something distinctive that men are for and that we should kind of train them towards. And so absent clear cultural scripts and distracted by what I call electronic opiates and moving to an economy that's less male friendly in some important respects, a lot of our young men are floundering, and then that inhibits, their marriageability. So that's a big issue.
And a sort of related question, I suppose, and you can look at this maybe from the male side as well, from Blake Muller, who asks, I feel like a book title like Get Married misses out on people who choose to get married but cannot find a spouse. And I think this does get a little bit less attention in your book. You talk a lot about the benefits and how to make the marriage successful, but the basic spouse finding is a big hurdle for a lot of people. So, did you have any thoughts about how people who do have the motive but lack the opportunity could move towards this goal?
Yeah, it's a good challenge. And I don't spend a lot of time on this in the book. And so a couple ideas here. One is I think we need to encourage young adults to be much more open to marriage and finding a spouse in college, or if they're not in the college track as young adults. I'm not saying you have to get married at 22. I'm just sort of saying like, for most of us, like there's no better place to meet someone than in a college context. There's so many people you meet who could potentially be good spouses down the road. So that's one thing I would say. I would definitely discourage people from thinking you have to get married around age 30 rather than, as I said, like 22 or 24 or 26. So kind of encouraging 20-something marriages so you don't miss out on potentially a great partner when you're a senior in college or an early employee in your early 20s somewhere. I think, if you've got a religious bone in your body, definitely, heading to your local church or synagogue, mosque or temple, it's a good place to meet people who are more marriage minded oftentimes. And you're going to be surrounded by folks who are going to be supportive of your marriage once you do get married, typically in those contexts as well. I think even geographic considerations are not top of mind for folks. They should be, right? So we're going to have a platform hopefully next year, I think Super Family Studies, on kind of where to find a spouse, and just by doing, good data crunching, so if you're a young woman, probably moving to New York City, in your 20s is not a good idea if you want to get married, just because the ratios of women to men in New York City aren't great. And there are other places where you're going to find more available men who would, potentially make for good spouses, based upon a range of considerations, related to things like education and work status and just availability, or if you're religious, So the point I'm making is that people have to be as basically intentional about finding a spouse, I think, today as they are about their careers. And I can tell you from interacting with UVA students who are very career oriented, oftentimes that they're not nearly as strategic about finding a spouse as they are about, mapping out the first 10 years of their careers. And I think that's short-sighted because for most of us, our spouse is a lot more important. Our marriage and family are a lot more important than, our career trajectories.
Indeed. All right, let me look over my questions and make sure I haven't missed anything here. Here's one I think we've already alluded to early on. I don't know if you're familiar with Age of Shoddy. He's kind of a pessimistic cat, so it's not surprising he's picked up on some of the negativity about marriage. And his crude version of the question is what the bleep happened, but he follows it up with really just how did we get to this point where marriage and childbearing are regarded as dangerous negatives to a significant portion of people. It's historically counterintuitive and yet underexamined. And I think we've already alluded to this with the talk about the me-focused generation and then the reaction to high divorce rates. Do you have any further thoughts, though, on how marriage came to decline as much as it did? And how views became more negative?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's partly it's a first world problem, right? We live in what's relatively, the most affluent society known to human history, and so people depend less on, marriage and family than they did in previous generations. So I think that's part of the story. I think social media kind of makes people focus on things that are less, I think, important oftentimes and distract them from forging good relationships, including ones that might lead to marriage. I think we have an education kind of system that has people in school and in college and in graduate school way too long and puts too many people through college and graduate school as well. And that tends to inhibit their ability or interest in getting married in their 20s as well. I think, we've got real estate regulations that tend to make buying a house more pricey, and that inhibits marriage. We've got public policies that penalize marriage among working class Americans as well. So these are all of some of the factors that are in play here. But I think culturally, I do want to kind of return to this idea that I articulated before, and that is there's kind of a Midas mindset that privileges more status related endeavors and activities in terms of work and whatnot over family and the elite and pop culture that is, I think, leading people down a road that's going to make them pretty miserable in middle and later life. And this is played out actually the most consequentially in East Asia, where just incredible declines in marriage and childbearing. And people right now are like, they're, maybe living in ways that allow them to maximize professional success and free time and fun. But I think they're going to be pretty miserable when they're 75 and they have no spouse and no children and no grandchildren.
I wanted to follow up on that one actually, because you have these declining marriage and fertility rates in East Asia. Yet in your book, you identify Asian Americans as one of the marriage success stories. One of the you have several groups you say who are I forget the term you use, but they marry and stay married at high rates. Very religious people, very successful people, the educated, and East Asians are one of them. So what do you think accounts for that disjunction that you've got rates crashing in East Asia, but you said don't say East Asians, you say Asians, you include Indians, profile some Indian families. But do you think Asians in America are different than Asians in, say, Korea or Japan?
Yeah, I think, and I'm not an expert on, East Asian families, but the trends are a bit better in the US for Asians than they are in East Asia when it comes to marriage and childbearing. And I think the challenge in part in East Asia is that you have kind of like this sort of like clash of westernized views of work and romance that have been coming through for a few decades now in East Asia that are very awkwardly coexisting with more traditional norms about also work and family life that don't kind of fit together well. And in South Korea, I think, for instance, there are pretty strong expectations about how wives treat their mothers-in-law that are kind of more onerous. And then there are also like customs about moms preparing their kids for schooling exams in South Korea that are also pretty onerous. And yet then you have probably a pop culture that's heavily westernized and sort of stressing more individualistic themes and more romantic themes. And so I think probably in a sense, say like South Korean young adults, especially South Korean young women, are exposed to competing models of the good life in their own national culture of origin, and then these more westernized ideas about individuality and romance that do not fit together nicely. And so I think that's, whereas in the United States, I think an Asian American woman who is married will have, she'll have a more engaged husband, she'll have a more flexible workplace. So I think for all of our problems here in the US, I think probably we do family, probably better than they do family in some important respects now in a place like South Korea would be my guess. The important exception there too, I think, is that divorce and single parent are still kind of frowned upon more in South Korea than they are in the United States, right? And so I think, again, it's complicated, but I think where we're better off than South Korea is that where we expect men, I think, to be more engaged in their families once they're married with kids. Where we're worse off is we have, I think, less expectations about the importance of marriage, grounding, and guiding family life than is the case in East Asia.
While we're on the demographic categories, we also have, if East Asians are remarkably unlikely to get divorced or have kids out of wedlock, African Americans are remarkably likely to not get married in the first place and have kids out of wedlock. So I think now a majority of African American kids are growing up without married parents in the house. Am I correct in that statistic?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, over the course of their lives, yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, that is something. And especially if you look at the scale of the change, because as recently as I guess like the 1950s, yeah, rates were higher than rates for the white majority, but they were still like, 10%, not 60%. Do we have
So
any inkling of
yeah.
what hit that particular community so hard?
Um, so I think a couple of things that would explain the racial dynamics you're talking about. One is that when it comes to the transition in the economy from a more manufacturing economy to a more service economy, Black men were more likely to be involved in the manufacturing world, and when those jobs disappeared, affected by that in terms of their appeal and their attractiveness financially. And William Julius Wilson's obviously spoken and written about this in terms of marriageability issues for Black men. I think another thing is, it's more of a conservative point, but I think Black families were affected more by welfare changes in the 60s and 70s because they were lower income, and this is obviously highly debatable, but I think there's no question that our welfare policies in the 60s and 70s basically tended to penalize marriage and make husbands less salient or central for lower income families, and so black families were affected more by those public policy dynamics in the 60s and 70s. And then I think there's work done that suggests that kind of like the legacy of slavery left black relationships somewhat more fragile, in the post Civil War era, and even from there. And so when our culture turned against marriage and family life to some important extent in the late 60s and 70s, the shifts we were talking about before in terms of a more me first approach to marriage and family, that these cultural shifts in the 60s and 70s were more consequential for black couples and families than they were for white couples and families. One black sociologist talked about this in terms of like when, white America catches the cold, or cold, black America catches the flu, so to speak. And so there's just the idea is that the cultural shifts of the 60s and 70s ended up being more consequential in a negative way for black families than they were for other families in the US.
All right, thank you. Yeah, just something I think about ever since I saw that statistic. And I mean, I have a scientific interest in all these questions, but I do take them a little bit more. I don't know, personally, now that I'm a family man myself, I'm a bit more like viscerally bothered by my boys having to grow up without father or mother or what have you. So I think about that a lot. Just the scale of that change. It's mind boggling.
Well, and also one other point to make, I think, is there's like, even in academia, there's almost like an assumption that somehow talk about marriage is just, I mean, it's a silly conversation in the social sciences about how it's like it's cis, I don't know, patriarchal or white or whatever, thing. And like, that's just ridiculous. I mean, like, there have been times in American life when blacks are more likely to get married than whites. We know that there are strong marriage cultures in Nigeria and India and Egypt and China. It's like the idea that marriage is some kind of like white Christian, heterosexual thing is just like, that's just a very kind of blinkered, viewpoint. Like, just get out of it, buddy, and see the world. It's a big place, right? And there are strong marriage cultures in Africa and in Asia, and and the West, both historically and in the present times. And so, but that also makes the question that you asked that much more kind of important to answer, right? Why are black families relatively more fragile today, and what can we do to kind of, I would say, renew marriage and family life in African American communities across the U.S.?
All right. Well, I appreciate you taking your time to talk to me today, and I don't want to suck up too much more. But thank you for coming on the show. Are there any parting thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with?
I think, Jason, we've covered the key questions and themes in the book. So yeah, I think we've done the topic justice for one podcast.
All right. Well, thank you for talking with me. And thank you for listening to another episode of the Bullfish Hole podcast.